Welcome to episode 5 of Let's Rage Together, a podcast where two friends talk about the politics of total liberation and related topics.
We annihilated the world before your very ears.
You can't handle the truth.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 5 of Let's Rage Together, Smash the Patriarchy, an introduction to feminism, rape culture, and toxic masculinity. I'm Pete,
And I'm Taryn.
and on today's episode we'll be diving into that stuff as well as discussing some listener questions and feedback. Also, this is a special episode. Make sure you listen through to the end of the episode because T has written and recorded a really rad, relevant song that I think is pretty amazing and needs to be heard by everyone.
Okay, but just keep in mind that it's a DIY live home recording, so it doesn't sound great. And it's not played or sang very well, so just bear that in mind. So if this is the first episode that you're listening to, thanks so much for joining us. And if there's anything that you want to comment on or ask us about or suggest as an episode topic, you can email us on letsragetogetherpodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Instagram and Facebook, so if you want to follow us there, it's at Let's Rage Together Podcast.
And if you like what we're doing and you want to support us, we're on Patreon at patreon.com/Let's Rage Together. But if you don't want to commit to the monthly donation thing, we're also on PayPal at paypal.com/Let's Rage Together. The Patreon has some levels and rewards that we're pretty stoked about. And then other ways you can help us are just by like spreading the word, telling people about the podcast, liking and sharing stuff, giving us reviews, all that stuff.
So hopefully if you've listened to previous episodes, you'll notice that this one sounds exponentially better, hopefully. We just spent a bunch of money on new gear, so any support that you do give to us on Patreon or via PayPal will really help us with paying off the new gear that we got, and will also help us to keep creating podcast episodes and maintaining the podcast. So on that note, a huge thank you to Wes and Sean for being our first Patreon supporters. You guys are amazing.
Thank you. We didn't do our regular The Bad and the Rad segment last episode because we had way too much other stuff to talk about, but it's back.
It's time for the bad and the rad.
So in The Bad and the Rad, we briefly talk about some things we hate and some things we love. We also use this segment as kind of a way to touch on topics that might not warrant a full episode. Anything bad you feel like ranting about today, T?
Yeah, so for anyone who lives in Joburg, you've probably already heard by now that Cresta Shopping Centre in Randburg is planning to build an aquarium inside the mall next year, which they claim is for educational purposes.
Bullshit.
So, yeah. Bullshit. So obviously there was a lot of resistance to this online, and a quote from their Facebook post in response to all of the criticism and negative feedback they got was, "We acknowledge and appreciate everyone's concerns and opinions and want to be transparent with our shoppers throughout the process. Our hope for the aquarium is that it will exist as an educational experience for our shoppers, especially those who have not had the opportunity to experience marine life before. We also intend to educate the public on sea life, including education around littering, overfishing, and global warming of our oceans. We are working closely with marine specialists on this project who are ensuring that the selected fish and inhabitants will exist in a stress-free environment. The aquarium team has also ensured that the aquarium size allows the fish to move freely in a large space, and the coral and rocks offer quieter locations for the fish to rest. Please be assured that disease prevention, temperature control, and live monitoring systems will be built into the aquarium to monitor it 24/7, 365 days a year to ensure the safe and healthy environment for the fish. We are happy to address any questions that you might have."
What a bunch of shit, honestly. I
Really?
cannot believe they're building an aquarium in the mall.
It's crazy. And they mask it as some educational
Whatever.
tool.
It's just a marketing thing. They say they want to be transparent. It's literally just a way to get people to come spend money in the shitty mall.
Of course, if they really wanted an educational experience, they could use VR gear and 3D technology and all of this stuff that could be a legit little science experience for kids.
Yeah, I mean, it seems stupid. Like, if you want to get people to come into the mall and spend time there, there's so many other things they could do, like you just mentioned, that would get people to hang out more than just idly, walk by this aquarium and stare at some fish and then carry on. Never mind having to transport the fish from wherever, probably Durban or Richards Bay,
Yeah.
like hours. What a bunch of shit.
I also hate that they say that it's an educational experience, especially for those who have not had the opportunity to experience marine life before. This is not an experience of marine life. Imprisoning animals in any kind of unnatural setting is not a true experience.
I agree.
It's exactly the same as a zoo.
Yeah, that argument people often use to say, oh, but how will kids learn about animals if they don't experience them? But any kid you find can tell you much more about dinosaurs than they can tell you about most fish.
Yeah, exactly. So obviously there's a lot of resistance to this, which we completely agree with. And there was actually a protest this past weekend, the 6th of October, organized by Ban Animal Trading. So we were there, and there's also a petition, an online petition, which we'll share in the show notes. And then there's also the one where you can actually get handwritten signatures and submit them to the email address listed.
Yeah, otherwise what you can do is email Cresta, let them know that you're unhappy, give them bad reviews on their Facebook page, like comments. I think that's what we can do, just agitate and help them to realize the majority of people are against this. It's a stupid idea.
Yeah. So Pete, what bad thing of the millions in the world do you want to discuss today?
So Hambach Forest is an old growth forest in the west of Germany, close to Cologne. So the 10% of this forest that's left is currently under threat of being destroyed by a coal mine. The coal mining company, I cannot pronounce the name. It's in German. The abbreviation is RWE. Since 2012, there's been a bunch of activists occupying the forest as an act of resistance, but the mining company and the police are trying to evict them because RWE actually owns the land, even though it was municipal land before. So you can watch videos to see how violent the police are with the activists when evicting them. As far as I know, there are about 150 activists currently living inside the forest. I follow the hashtag Humbucker Forest on Instagram, and recently there were a whole bunch of people that went there kind of in solidarity with them and did a march and stuff. So these activists are doing nothing more than just peacefully occupying the forest, but the company is pretty desperate to get rid of them. One politician even called them violent left-wing extremists. So
ridiculous.
In response, they put up a photo of two of the activists holding an empty fire extinguisher to be like, this is the most dangerous weapon we have in the forest. You know? So the company RWE are mining this kind of coal that is like B-grade, really shitty coal. That coal is already bad, but it's one of the worst kind of coals you can get, the most polluting. But a statement from Hambach Forest's website is, the future of the planet is in our hands. It is time that we come together for a sustainable and just world beyond the deadly logic of capitalism. Together we can save the forest and the climate and create a world in which no living being is exploited. I think that's a really cool statement from them. It's really cool that as well that they are so like intersectional and vegan. And so, this whole thing like really bums me out that there's 10% of this forest left and a very small portion of people are trying to save what's left of it. And recently, a comrade and an activist and one of the journalists that were squatting there died falling from the trees. And so it's something that's really tragic that's been added onto the evictions that are already happening. And they halted the evictions for a while. I'm not 100% sure what's happening right now, so people can update me if you know more. But yeah, this whole thing really bums me out. But if you want to find more, you can go to hambachforest.org. That's HAMBACH forest.org. And you can follow them on social media. There's an account that I follow as well called Unoffensive Animal. And they also post quite a lot about what's happening there. And it just bums me out because besides for the activists dying and the evictions and stuff, what the fuck are we still doing? Mining fossil fuels in a country like Germany, that's technologically advanced. And a lot of environmentalists and environmental activists are, even mainstream ones, are against this company and what they're doing. But I think it takes a special kind of person to go there and risk your freedom, to save the forest, the animals in the forest, to stop them mining coal.
Yeah.
The recent update, though, on the upside is that some hackers are obviously supportive of Hambacher Forest have been like fucking with RWE's website. I think that's quite cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So, T, on the upside, what's something that you are stoked about at the moment? What's a rad?
So I always struggle to find a rad.
We're such negative people.
We're horrible. But I thought since we're doing an episode on feminism, I wanted to find a local nonprofit organization that specifically works to empower women or young girls. And it was surprisingly difficult to find. A lot of the nonprofit organizations don't have the time or the money or the resources for particularly good online presence. So maybe I just can't find them. So the only one that I could really find was an organization called 1828. And to quote from their website, 1828 is an award-winning, woman-led nonprofit organization that empowers young women from disadvantaged backgrounds by developing strategies for their educational and personal development. We encourage young women between the ages of 18 and 28 to view higher education as an attractive and necessary tool for their empowerment. Our approach is empathetic, skills-enhancing, and relevant to the young women we serve, since we have experienced some of our beneficiaries' challenges firsthand. So some of the objectives that they have is they facilitate life skills workshops for girls in grade 11 and 12 in marginalized communities specifically. They also provide mentors for young women at a tertiary level through their Big Sister network. They also give financial assistance for higher education needs. And then they produce successive generations of mentors and educated women in all sectors. They also help to curb youth unemployment by recruiting and training community-based youth to facilitate their workshops, which I think is really cool. So they're empowering people within marginalized communities and, mentoring these young girls. And then those girls in turn also become workshop facilitators or mentors themselves. So I just thought that was a really cool organization doing a lot of really good work for disadvantaged girls.
Yeah, it sounds really cool. I mean, I also don't really know much stuff happening in South Africa that helps women specifically.
I was a bit saddened to see that I couldn't really find many others. So if you stay in South Africa or actually anywhere in the world and you know of really great organizations like this or organizations that also empower non-binary people or, any kind of empowering nonprofit, I would love to hear about them. What about you, Pete?
So MyRad is a small company based here in Johannesburg called Herbivore. HERBI space VOHR. It's run by this great couple, Daniel and Annika.
They're amazing.
They're also really involved in the activist community here in Johannesburg, and they're just great people. So Herbivore make seitan-based faux meats, and their products are amazing. And they make things like biltong, which, if you don't know, it's like a savory, salted, dried meat.
It's kind of like the South African version of beef jerky, I guess.
But less gross.
Yeah, well,
it's still gross. They make the most amazing vegan biltong, even spare ribs. So yeah, I just think they're a great little company to support. They're making amazing faux meats and, in my opinion, like kind of revolutionizing vegan food in South Africa at the moment.
Totally.
Just the two of them, and they really are like such great people. So we'll post a link to where you can check them out in the show notes. I'm not sure if they ship internationally or whatever, but you can check it out.
Either way, if you can buy some, just buy some. Your life will be so much better.
It's great.
So as we said earlier, we normally just do rads and bads, but today we have a maybe as well. So we're discussing something that we not entirely sure if it's a good or a bad thing, but we just thought we'd have a little discussion about it.
So last week, I'm sure a lot of you saw that there was a World Day for Farmed Animals, in which a lot of people, they took a pledge to fast for a day in solidarity with farmed animals globally. And what they would do, from what I could tell, is write, basically, I am fasting with animals. This many animals are killed. Basically wrote it on a sign and posted a selfie to raise awareness about the plight of farmed animals.
Yeah, and before we discuss our opinion on this fast, if you did fast, please don't take offense to the discussion we're about to have. A lot of our friends fasted, and that's partly why we feel it's important to have this discussion. We don't expect you to agree with us on this, but we hope we can share some ideas and some critical discussions around this.
Yeah, exactly. So on their website, it says, each day, 160 million farmed animals are transported to meet their gruesome end at slaughterhouses throughout the world. These caring, sensitive individuals are denied food, water, and rest on their journeys for several hours up to days. They are scared, they are starving, and their suffering is silenced by an industry that doesn't want us to know the truth. Yet we refuse to be silent. Together, tens of thousands will rise on October 2nd to speak the truth about farmed animals. In the historical tradition of Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King Jr., and Mahatma Gandhi, we will join together in a one-day fast against slaughter in solidarity with these innocent victims. Through our voluntary sacrifice of food on this day, we will amplify the voices of the billions of farmed animals suffering around the world. We will inspire others to learn the truth. And we will mobilize a compassionate global community who will not wait for justice, but who will make it a reality. So yeah, that's from their website, dayforanimals.com. What do you think about this fast, T?
I have mixed feelings about it. I mean, I've heard a lot of activists say that it kind of made them feel more in tune with the suffering of animals and kind of gave them more drive to be more active. So kind of as a day of reflection of kind of experiencing the suffering that might happen when being transported to slaughter. I have kind of a problem with that notion. I mean, I agree with the fact that it could help some people to kind of empathize more, but I also don't think that we have to try and understand their suffering to be able to fight for them. Like, we're fighting for justice. We don't have to make ourselves suffer in order to understand their suffering. You know, on some of the posters, it said lines like, live one day like mine. And I really disagree with that. I really have a problem with that, because voluntarily not having food for a day is not the same as being forced onto a truck in the middle of summer, driving through the heat without water or food, not knowing what's going on. It's not the same as just saying, I'm going to choose to not have food today.
Also crammed in with hundreds of their peers.
Like, if you wanted to really live a day like theirs, go sit in a hot truck with 50 other people, no food, no water, and just let someone drive you without telling you when they're going to stop. That might be a little bit more realistic. But even that, I don't understand why we have to do that. We don't have to feel that suffering to understand it or to know that it's wrong. Also,
I agree with you. Just because someone is suffering doesn't mean we need to lash ourselves and also suffer. I think there are a lot of amazing activists globally who wouldn't have fasted, who can't go to vigils because they can't face it. They won't watch Dominion, but in no way are they less urgent or less aware about the suffering that animals face and the injustice that is animal agriculture. But I do agree with you that a potential pro could be seeing it as like a day of reflection. I think it's less problematic if it's kind of reframed as like, hey, everyone, let's take a day and not have food and think about the suffering of the animals. You know, so it's like a reflection thing more than this is something we're doing in solidarity with animals, or like this illusion that you're somehow even remotely feeling the suffering of what the animals go through. I mean, from what we saw, a lot of people seem to be really upset doing it. They seem to have no energy and just want to sleep. And I think both of us agree that it would be more useful on the day to rather be active than to just be like sad and doing nothing.
Yeah, I mean, the animals don't know that you're like suffering in solidarity with them. So it's not like they're going to appreciate it. They're still going to actual slaughterhouses that same day.
Yeah. Which I think is also a sad kind of illusion that people have. Because essentially the animals really don't care that you are fasting.
I think the animals would be more stoked if they could have a comprehension of what you're doing. They would be more stoked with you making one person go vegan that day than just not eating with them. If I was on my way to a slaughterhouse, I wouldn't want my friends and family to like not eat in solidarity that day. I'd want them to go and fight for me.
Yeah.
But aside from that, I also just want to highlight the problematic notion that, like, yes, it's on social media and yes, it's online to raise awareness, but what awareness are we really raising? Why does there have to be this post of yourself holding the sign? If you think of it from the perspective of what is the goal of the fast, is it just to have that sort of reflective day and build a vegan community where you feel like other people are fighting alongside you? Because I feel like the only people that are going to respond to this are vegans.
Yeah.
From a non-vegan perspective, if a non-vegan cannot empathize with the suffering that animals are actually going through, how are they going to empathize with you being a bit hungry one day?
Yeah.
It's not gonna help them shift towards veganism any faster, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. I also think it can have a can be a problematic thing, because fasting, even though they use these three famous political figures that people always use as examples, that fasting can have a religious connotation, and people already have this bad impression of veganism as being like a religion,
Or like a
being
cult, yeah.
like a cult or dogmatic or whatever. So could it possibly be negatively impacting veganism from a non-vegan's perspective if they like look at these weird people who are now being even weirder and fasting? I don't know.
I don't think personally that there's much negative effect. I don't really hold any criticism against any individuals that I know that did fast.
No, me neither.
If it was meaningful to them, then that's cool. You know, for me personally, I would feel if I'm just like tired and lethargic all day, it's not really going to help me empathize more with the animals. I would rather just be doing something active for animals.
Yeah. And like I said, you don't need to be doing everything. There are many vegans who didn't watch Dominion and who I don't think need to empathize with the suffering of animals. There are many vegans who, if they watched it or went to a vigil or something, it would just demotivate them and it would make them misanthropic and sad. And they know that it will not give them the energy they need to actually be active, which is what animals need. And so maybe the same thing, if for the day you are being reflective and it is about yourself, then I think that's cool. But I don't think we should be like under this illusion that we are kind of helping animals.
Do you think that there's any pros to the fast itself, like in terms of creating awareness for veganism?
I mean, yes, but I don't see how the attention that you could be getting from doing a fast is more effective than a lot of the other ways that vegans get attention. Or if you went to do outreach or something, I think it would be far more effective.
I guess in a way, it might open up conversation. So maybe if you're in an environment where you often around people and they're seeing what you're eating and then notice, oh, today Pete's not eating anything. Hey, Pete, why are you not eating today? It could open up an opportunity for conversation about why you're fasting. But further than that, I mean, there are other ways to open up conversations. And even then, if I think of my non-vegan friends and family, I don't know how many of them would respond positively if I went to like a family gathering and said, I'm not eating today because I'm fasting for animals. A lot of my like extended family would just be like, oh, okay, that's weird. You know, they would probably avoid the conversation more than anything because it would make them feel uncomfortable. I can picture much more effective ways of opening up debates.
Yeah, I agree. I think also it doesn't sit well with me to compare the fast against slaughter, like awareness raising thing for animals, to the fasts done by Chavez or Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi, because you cannot just say that because they fasted, we are fasting. You have to look at the motivation, the historical context, the political gains they want to get from doing this, you know? So, like, you know, if someone is doing it for a political gain, like, give us this right, and until you do, we will fast. So if we die, it's your fault. Versus, I'm fasting in solidarity with someone else who's hungry.
Yeah.
It's different. And so it doesn't sit well with me to say, we are doing this fast. Here are 3 random people we chose from history who are super famous, who fasted. So we are using the same tool. I think you cannot just isolate the tool without looking at their motives.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially in the sense of how many people that fasted thought about the goal. So aside from the fact that you just kind of taking this strategy that was used by someone else in a completely different context, firstly, have you looked at that historical context? What was the goal? What was the motivation? And was it effective? Or was there a better strategy that we've since learned we could use? So is it firstly effective to use that strategy in the current context? And then have you thought about the current context? Like, do you have a defined goal? How many people who fasted thought about what that goal is and whether fasting is the best way to reach that goal?
Yeah, I think fasting is a tool of non-violent activism. And so a lot of people like hyper glorify non-violence. And so they aren't open to a diversity of tactics that might include things that they think are violent. But to me, it's more consistent to be like, okay, look at prisoners. They have such little power that the only way that they can get what they want sometimes is by doing a fast. So they like, we aren't going to eat until you improve this condition or whatever.
Yeah.
So a more consistent way, if we are going to use other political fasts to say we're doing the same thing, is more something like all vegans globally are going to stop eating until animal agriculture ends, or something like that. To me, it rubs me the wrong way to compare it to like a politically motivated fast.
Even that, I think the problem with fasting specifically in this context is that when you talk about fine, all vegans worldwide are going to fast until things change. Veganism is so very focused on food.
Very.
You're using food as a tool to address food issues, which often is not the case. Often people are fasting for other political motives.
Exactly.
You cannot remove food from the vegan struggle at the moment. So you're using food when that is very often the subject of mockery when you're talking about veganism. So we're already these like extreme grass eaters in the, from the perspective of non-vegans a lot of the time. Now we're going to just stop eating altogether. I feel like a lot of people would just make a mockery out of that. And I can imagine being the brunt of many jokes if all vegans just say, okay, we're going to stop eating till this changes. How many people are going to say, cool, let's let the vegans die?
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
I just feel like veganism is so entrenched in food that food is maybe not the best tool to use to fight that when people are already not listening to our discussions around food. Not that veganism is only about food, but it's very central to veganism.
I think that's a brilliant point. Going back to the religious objection that I had, sometimes I look at the things that the vegan movement comes up with for awareness, and I wonder how you get from, I care about this issue, so I'm going to do this action. Like we actually spoke about this recently, and it was kind of a joke, but I think it's like a relevant thing to say, is we can imagine some vegan coming up with something else that has kind of a religious connotation to it, like a vegan baptism, or if you did like a fire walk or something. So it's like veganism is like a rebirth, and so you're like this new person, and so let's do a baptism, and then everyone around the world has to take a selfie video baptizing yourself or something to be like,
it's not that far removed.
That's what I have an issue with. I feel like just people aren't just critical enough of like, okay, here's something we can do. But I don't know, maybe this also was popular because of the narcissistic aspect of getting a photo of yourself and posting it.
Yeah, and I don't think that's the case with everyone. I think a lot of people have legitimately good intentions, but there are also a lot of narcissists in the vegan world.
Yes, as everyone knows.
Yes. So I think that is something to be aware of. But also back to the suffering side of it and, having to put yourself through suffering because the animals are suffering. If we look at other things that are occurring in animal agriculture, like the debeaking of chickens, how insane would it be if we cut the tips of our noses off or the tips of our fingers off in solidarity and like, oh, look at me standing in solidarity, cutting the tips of my fingers off because did you know what happens to chickens? Yeah, you're going to get a shitload of awareness, but not the right kind.
But this is exactly what I mean. I don't think it's too far of a stretch to imagine someone coming up with this idea. Here's this thing that's happening. Let's do this other thing in solidarity. And suddenly you have vegans with ends of their noses missing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if it loosely makes sense, then suddenly there's 1,000 people jumping on board. And yeah. Basically, moral of the story is, I don't know if this is a good or a bad thing. Personally, I don't think I'll be taking part in any kind of fast anytime soon, unless it's for my own reflection. Even that's probably not. But basically, if you're going to engage in any kind of awareness activity, just think critically about it.
Think critically, and imagine, like, is this good for the vegan movement? Does this actually like help animals?
And what is the goal? What is the goal of the whole campaign, and can it be reached by this method?
Yeah. I mean, as critical as we sound, we aren't trying to shoot anyone down. If you did this, cool. But all we are saying is be critical.
Yeah. If you disagree with us, or you think that we interpreted the fast in the wrong way, or maybe you did the fast and you experienced something really positive from it, then we'd love to hear. Even if you just did the fast and you have thoughts on it that you want to share, please email us. We'd love to hear.
Okay, so moving on from the bad and the rad, we had a couple of listeners send in comments and questions. We got an email from actually our one patron, Sean, who asked us what our view is on guard dogs. I think this is a pretty common kind of gray area thing within veganism that a lot of vegans don't know how to discuss. And we are no authority, but here are our thoughts. What do you think about guard dogs, T?
So I think a lot of vegans don't have an issue with using guide dogs for people who have visual impairments, but a lot of vegans do have an issue because it's animal exploitation essentially. So from my perspective, I'm not disabled, so I don't feel like it's my place to say that it's an easy thing to just outright ban. But previously I've thought that if it's going to happen, if people do need guide dogs to help them, then I thought, okay, maybe I'd be more okay with it if they were adopted dogs from shelters, because a lot of those dogs are going to get euthanized anyway. So if they can have a semi-decent life and train to help someone, they're improving that person's life and then essentially having another shot at life. And also if they're trained in a way that's still fun and that they can still have a good quality of life and essentially have time to be a dog, then I think I would be more accepting of it. But I'm not sure how possible that is. So I've heard that it takes quite a few years to train a dog to be a guide dog. It sounds a little bit like this humane kind of bullshit. Like, yeah, but if they're well trained and, so I don't know. I don't know the whole process. So I'm speaking from a very uninformed place. But either way, it does make me really uneasy to just accept the use of animals for any kind of human benefit. I think if animals were not viewed as commodities in the first place, by now there would be amazing technology around to help people with those kind of disabilities without forcing an animal to do that. One of the comments that I saw when I was reading about this was also, why not employ humans to do this? It could actually be more beneficial to employ a human to do this job. It is, at the end of the day, a job. These dogs are even referred to as working dogs, but they don't have the ability to consent to that. And I also often wonder, and I could be completely wrong about this, but I find that it seems to me like a lot of these dogs are in very stressful environments with lots of people, busy spaces. Also, when the dog is quote unquote working, you can't approach them because they're working. And I feel like that could also very much isolate the person. Instead of someone saying, can I help you out, or even just going to talk to them, it's like, oh, they have a dog who's working, you can't approach the dog, so it's not far off from just don't approach the person.
Yeah, I agree with you largely. I think that there are already some alternatives because not all blind people have dogs. So they manage to get around with walking sticks, and there are those things on the floor in some first world cities that I've been in, like kind of gridded tiles, and it shows blind people where to walk and
it's like textured pathways.
Yes,
almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not a solution because people who live in areas where this doesn't happen, or the city doesn't cater, or wherever they live, maybe in rural areas. But my perspective is that this is such a fringe kind of sideline issue in veganism that it's actually like one of the last issues we should focus on. I mean, I agree with you that we are speaking from very much a place of ignorant privilege, with both of us not being blind, and I don't even know any blind people actually. So it's not something that I also feel comfortable with saying, okay, this is the solution. I don't feel like I know enough to say like this kind of use of animals is necessarily outright wrong. I think it is very much a gray area, and it will stay that way. I also agree that if it just didn't exist, like using dogs to guide humans, then there would be other technologies developed.
Yeah, I'm very wary of speaking from this privileged perspective of just saying, well, you can't use animals, so just deal with your own issues. It's super ableist. But at the same time, I don't want to be speciesist and be like, oh, well, if a human has a disability, then it's okay to exploit animals. It's such a tricky balance between, not discriminating against the animal or the human.
That's just why I think it's like something that vegans and anyone who cares about animal rights can kind of, for now, just sideline, because there are so many more important issues to be focusing on, and this will be kind of dealt with as speciesism is eradicated.
I agree with that, but I also think that it's important to have the discussion, and I think the most important discussion to have would be with the community of blind people and ask them, what are your needs? Are your needs being met by having a guide dog or not having a guide dog? How would your needs best be met, and how then can technology be developed? Maybe there's a way to have human employment and also some kind of technology to bridge the gaps where you are by yourself.
Yeah, I agree. I think speciesism and ableism are both social justice issues that need to be solved, and that it's always more effective to speak to people than about people.
Yeah.
So I love the idea that you have of, we cannot decide on behalf of are visually impaired people what should be done. They need to be involved in the solution.
They need to lead the solution in the debates. Yeah,
exactly. We also got an email from one of our listeners in Wales, Jade, who said, feedback on episode 4. Hey, Taryn Pete. Once again, I enjoyed the latest episode, but I especially was pleased that you discussed the ableist aspect on a total ban of all plastic straws. Unfortunately, not enough people realize this, but I also believe the problem stems from them disassociating with the bigger issue completely, i.e. fishing, and feel rather happy with themselves for declining plastic straws whilst munching down on fish and chips or a burger or whatever. Last night, Sea Shepherd UK and Cambrian Beach Guardians here in North Wales organised a show of Blue, and once again there wasn't a single mention of veganism in the film, or in the pre-presentations to be honest. They did talk about fishing, in brackets overfishing / illegal fishing and unsustainable fishing mainly, but I'm sure you can guess what came at the end. Stop eating unsustainable fish. And as you said, this is urgent. There is no time to waste. The film was beautifully filmed, aesthetically pleasing, and there were some positive messages I really liked, showing the difference one person can make, such as a beach ranger in Australia saving over 300 turtles and picking up over 13,000 fishing nets. But unfortunately, I still feel that hopelessness. Because yes, one person can make a difference, but they must be active, such as this man and the other people portrayed in the film. It is not enough to be all I'm vegan, therefore not contributing, and even those people who refuse single-use plastic, etc. If we really want to make a difference and save lives, we have to be active. Get out there and clean up the beaches, clean out the stomachs of baby birds who have been fed plastic because their mothers thought it was food. In brackets, this was a very distressing thing to watch in the film. A baby bird forcibly regurgitating hundreds of pieces of plastic. It wasn't even 100 days old yet. And when I pointed out to someone I was sitting next to that the film was really good, but it should advocate veganism and also give specific tips to people on how to reduce their plastic use, such as buy bamboo toothbrushes, shampoo bars rather than plastic bottles, etc., etc., they said that people would be put off and defensive. Fair enough, I understand this, but if we just start sending out little messages about actual ways to reduce plastic, rather than expect them to research themselves, because we all know people are great at doing this, not, they will go home feeling angry and wanting to do something, but a week later will have forgotten all about it. We just know this is human nature. I'm guilty of it, we all are. And the main point I always think of is, we would never tell someone to just stop being racist or sexist one day a week, so why is this any different? Okay, rant over, I think. Back to the beginning and the listener question from Rich. I thought I would just add my 2 cents as I faced this problem massively when writing my dissertation. Of course, I wanted to tackle everything. Animals in social work, environmental racism, psychological impact of working in slaughterhouses, animals exploited in social work for the benefit of humans, how anti-oppressive. Animalization of people of color, sexualization of animals and animalization of women, ableism in the vegan movement, and so on and so forth, you get the picture. How delusional I was to think I could even attempt to cover just a few of these in 20,000 words. So I eventually narrowed my topic down to an ecofeminist perspective of animals and social work. And even when I got to the end, I reflected on how that wasn't narrow enough, and I should have narrowed it further. But I also mentioned that it was dangerous to not consider the whole picture, and hence why I tried to bring in a few bits and pieces about some of these issues. I feel I failed the topic because I was unable to do it justice, but my main hope at this point is that whoever reads it will begin to think more critically about their own actions and what being a social worker actually means to them, if we are willing to pay for the abuse of animals whilst advocating for humans. So, the point is, I could never have tackled everything. I was forced to break it down, but I maintained throughout the importance of the bigger picture. Sorry for such a long rant. Looking forward to the next one, Jade.
Amazing. Thank you, Jade, for that detailed feedback. I haven't actually seen the documentary Blue, but I'm quite keen to watch.
And I would love to read your dissertation.
Yes, I think I've actually asked if I can, Jade. Hint, hint. These are some really good points. I get frustrated with documentaries or presentations or anything where there's this vague, watered down, apologetic message. As Jade mentioned, we would never ask someone to not be sexist or racist one day a week. Why do we do that with veganism? I think people can understand a message pretty easily if you just give them the opportunity to. And I think it's insulting to people to assume that you'll overwhelm them with information if you just tell it like it is.
Yeah, and people will be put off if you just say, hey, can you stop saying all your racist jokes? And they're like, oh, you're going to put people off. You know?
Yeah, could we just like cut down a little bit? I mean,
Yeah.
you know, it's ridiculous. So I definitely feel your frustration there, Jade. And then in terms of your response to Rich's question, I totally agree that there are just too many issues to tackle all at once, like we discussed in the last episode. And sometimes it is really, really important to really hone in on the details of one issue and tackle that. But looking at the bigger picture as far as possible, whether you're talking about plastic pollution or veganism, I think the goal should just be look at the bigger picture and solve specific problems where you can.
I think Jade's making a perfect example of our conclusion in the last episode, that you need to do what you can where you are with what you have.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
So the topic that Jade narrowed it down to was amazing. And if each person, not that everyone's writing a dissertation, but they kind of narrow their topic of focus down to what they care about, then the world would be a much better place.
Yeah, and then share the information that you gather. So yeah, thanks for that email, Jade. It was awesome to read and awesome to share with everyone.
Thanks, Jade.
But moving on to our main topic of discussion for today, Smash the Patriarchy, an introduction to feminism, rape culture, and toxic masculinity. The topic of feminism is really broad and has so many interconnected and overlapping issues. So this is really a very rudimentary discussion that we're going to have. We are in no way experts on any of these topics, as I'm sure you know by now.
Or any topics that we ever speak about.
Yes, as you know. But we wanted to open the discussion and mention a few things that we could possibly do some full episodes on in future. So we'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback. And if there's any important aspect that you think we should have included, please let us know by emailing us at letsragetogetherpodcast@gmail.com.
It was really difficult because of how broad feminism is to narrow this discussion down to what we did. So I think we left a lot out.
Yeah, there's probably huge gaps in what we're discussing today, so bear with us, but hopefully this will be a good introduction if you're not familiar with feminism. Before we get started, we wanted to just give a trigger warning. We are going to be discussing a lot of difficult topics, including things like rape culture, domestic violence, sexual assault, and also general discussion surrounding patriarchy and gender-related issues. And we feel that these topics are really important to discuss openly and honestly in our goal of moving towards a better world. So we encourage everyone to listen, even if you might find some of the content a little bit difficult to hear.
Yeah, so to start off, we thought we should define what feminism actually is. I love this quote by Mary Shear that says, "Feminism is the radical notion that women are people."
That's amazing.
That was brilliant. So according to Wikipedia, their article on feminism is actually really good. It says, "Feminism is a range of political movements, ideologies, and social movements that share a common goal: to define, establish, and achieve political, economic, personal, and social equality of sexes. This includes seeking to establish educational and professional opportunities for women that are equal to those for men."
I think it's important to note here as well that this definition refers to sexes, but I think in a lot of contexts, gender equality is more accurate, in my opinion.
I agree.
A lot of definitions that I've found also make mention of men and women a lot of the time, and non-binary people are just left out of the discussion completely. So I also just want to highlight that in the discussion that we're having now, we will also be referring a lot of the time to the binary of men and women, but it's just for ease of reference. So please don't think that we're trying to exclude anyone. We're just referring to everyone on the gender spectrum when we're talking. We're just using words like men and women for ease.
When we really mean kind of male, non-male in a large part of it.
Yeah, however you identify. So that's basically what feminism is in a nutshell. But what is feminism not?
So one word that people often use that really pisses me off is the word feminazi.
Oh, yeah.
It's so fucking irritating. So according to Wikipedia, feminazi is a pejorative term for feminists popularized by politically conservative American radio talk show host Rush Limbaugh. That guy's a fucking idiot. So I just find the term super offensive. Like, you cannot be a feminazi unless you are a feminist and a Nazi, which does not make sense. Otherwise, I think it's unacceptable to call anyone a Nazi who is not actively participating in a genocide of people. Basically, I think besides the fact that it's is demeaning of feminism and of anyone who kind of fights for feminism, it also trivializes what the Nazi party did by calling someone a Nazi. No feminists are committing a genocide. So you cannot say you are fighting too strongly for women's rights or non-male rights. So you are a feminazi. I really hate it.
Same. And I think we'll kind of discuss this more later on, but just the fact that that word even ever got used shows so much about patriarchy, and just the kind of characterization of women who stand up for anything.
As equivalent to someone who would literally kill millions of people.
Yeah, exactly.
So just a side note, I don't think we should be calling anyone a Nazi at all.
Yeah.
Even grammar Nazi, I think, is kind of an unacceptable
Yeah.
thing to say.
So another thing that feminism is not, which is such a widespread assumption that I've heard, especially lately for some reason, man-hating. Feminists don't hate men. It's not about hating men at all. It's about hating misogyny. So just to clarify, I know we use Wikipedia a lot, but often their definitions are pretty good. So Wikipedia defines misogyny as the hatred of, contempt for, or prejudice against women or girls. Misogyny is manifest in numerous ways, including social exclusion, sex discrimination, hostility, androcentrism, patriarchy, male privilege, belittling of women, violence against women, and sexual objectification. So feminism is just anti all of those things. It's not anti-men.
Another thing that feminism is not is that it is not only about women and women's issues. Feminism is for everyone. And when I say everyone, I mean every kind of person, even the people who think that it is against them. Patriarchy is bad for everyone.
Yeah.
So we'll get more into this and expand more on the point the further we go into the discussion. But one thing I would like to suggest that people watch is Chimamanda Adichie Ngosi's TED Talk, We Should All Be Feminists, or pick up the little book. We'll link to the talk in the show notes.
Another sort of myth about feminism is that men can't be feminists, which I completely disagree with. As you said, feminism is for everyone. Everyone should be a feminist. I have heard some feminists criticize the idea that men can be feminists, and they prefer the idea of men being feminist allies rather than feminists, because if you are, for example, a white dude, you cannot understand the lived experience of women every day. So it can sort of diminish feminism or the female experience by claiming to be a feminist as a man. I personally don't have a problem with it, but I do understand why some feminists prefer that non-female identifying people rather refer to themselves as allies.
Yeah, so I guess I would consider myself to be a feminist, but I wouldn't fight with someone who told me you need to be a feminist ally. Essentially, what they mean when they say you need to be a feminist ally is basically you need to learn to shut up and listen.
Yeah.
So why does feminism matter, and why do we need to smash the patriarchy? I think to understand why feminism matters, we first need to discuss what the problems with sexism and patriarchy are.
There's a really good blog called finallyfeminism101.wordpress.com. We'll also obviously link that in the show notes, but they have a lot of really good definitions on their site. And their definition for sexism says, sexism is both discrimination based on gender and the attitudes, stereotypes, and the cultural elements that promote this discrimination. Given the historical and continued imbalance of power, where men as a class are privileged over women as a class, see male privilege, an important but often overlooked part of the term is that sexism is prejudice plus power. Thus, feminists reject the notion that women can be sexist towards men because women lack the institutional power that men have. I think this is a really, really important way to define sexism, similar to the way that when you talk about racism, people of color essentially cannot be racist because one definition of racism includes institutionalized oppression of people of color. In the same way, when we're talking about sexism, sexism includes that power imbalance. So your institutionalized power as a man versus a woman is not just discrimination or prejudice. So as a woman, I can be prejudiced towards men, but not sexist.
Yeah, I agree. Because white people have never been oppressed based on their race. Men have never been oppressed based on their gender.
Exactly. And another note, when we're talking about power imbalances, I think is really important, especially for white feminists, to take note of, is the intersections of power and institutionalized oppression in general. So while as a general class, men have more power than women, there are certain situations, especially in the South African context, for example, where some women do have institutionalized power over men based on other things like race. So as a white female, you might have less power than a white male, but more power based on race as compared to a black male.
I think that's a really good point.
So I think it's just important to remember that we are talking about sexism now, but we can't ignore intersections between those oppressions and how they affect different individuals differently.
Really good point. Because we're talking about smashing the patriarchy, it's probably important to define patriarchy. So basically, it's a social system in which males hold primary power and predominate in roles of political leadership, moral authority, social privilege, and control of property. It's a system of inequality which favors maleness and the male ideal.
I think that's a pretty comprehensive definition. And I think the important thing to focus on here is the male ideal. That there's this characteristic male picture that we have in our minds that is promoted in society as the ideal. And the problem with patriarchy, beyond just the sexist connotations, is also that there's this assumption of the gender binary in society where there's maleness and femaleness, and that's it. So it's always male versus female, and male in a position of power over a woman, and it's very heteronormative. There's no like inclusion of different gender and sexual preferences.
Yeah, I mean, you even see this play out in terms of homophobia and homosexuality, because I think homophobia comes from like a patriarchal view of the world. And even within homosexual relationships, you get people, so they define their roles in the relationship based on the gender binary, which is problematic in itself.
Yeah.
But maybe we should also define gender binary so that people know what we're talking about. So also Wikipedia.
Trusty Wikipedia.
The gender binary is the classification of sex and gender into two distinct, opposite, and disconnected forms of masculine and feminine. The gender binary is one general type of gender system. Sometimes in this binary model, sex, gender, and sexuality are assumed by default to align. So for example, if a male is born, gender binarism assumes the male will be masculine in appearance, character traits, and behavior, including having a heterosexual attraction to females.
That's such an important point that's so entrenched in patriarchy. From the time you're born, the whole of society just decides all of these things for you and on behalf of you based on this gender binary.
Yeah, because sex is a biological feature, gender is a construct, a social construct that we are taught and learn.
Yeah. And this gender binary and patriarchy as a whole just perpetuates this hierarchy of gender and sexuality. There's this power imbalance where, like we said, there's this male ideal. So anything different to maleness is seen as less than. So other genders, other sexualities.
Yeah, so that idea enforces oppressive gender roles. So because of this super narrow, rigid view of gender, you have to be forced into what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man. Nothing outside of that is acceptable. And then even within that, there's not much leeway for anything. So because of that, you have examples of male privilege, such as the pay gap. So for people who aren't aware of that, which will actually blow my mind if you aren't, the pay gap is the fact that globally, men are paid more than women for the same jobs, the same skilled positions. And then within the pay gap between men and women, you can get more intersectional about it, of how, say, like black women will be paid less than white women, but still less than men in the same roles as them. So according to finally Feminism 101, when I'm talking about male privilege, I'm talking about a set of privileges that are given to men as a class due to their institutional power in relation to women as a class.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about things like the pay gap and male privilege, there's so many interconnected issues that, you know, one problem exacerbates another. So, for example, when we look at traditional gender roles of caretaking, for example, that still today falls hugely on the shoulders of women. So it's not entirely surprising when you look at the reasons for the differences in pay between male and female. It's often because females still have to prioritize looking after children and running the household in addition to having a career. She is the one that will have to choose. And again, we're using very binary terms here, but in a kind of heterosexual relationship, if there's a man and a woman, the woman will be the one to choose, okay, I have to now choose between my career and looking after kids. Whereas generally for a guy, it will just be like, oh, well, I'm carrying on with my career. It's just a given that the first person who's going to have to compromise in any way is going to be the woman.
Exactly.
That's obviously not relevant to everyone, but it still is very widespread, I think.
I think it also comes from this idea by some mainstream intellectuals that males are generally better suited biologically towards capitalism. which I think is just such a destructive way of thinking. And a lot of people buy into this. And I'm talking about recent modern intellectual people who are saying shit like this.
And that ties in very much to this idea of like career suitability. Like men should have certain professional careers and women should have more nurturing or more female suitable careers, which is such garbage. It's all just like socialization. Women are just as good at any job as men if they want to be, and vice versa. I think it's damaging for women and men, and I'm including everyone again. It's damaging to have these ideas that certain kinds of people are only suited to certain kinds of careers.
Yeah, it's complete shit. So I think it's important at this point to also note that we are largely talking about from one cultural perspective. So it's important to realize that cultural stereotypes are different across cultures of what it means to be a man and a woman, but essentially the problem is still the same of having oppressive expected gender roles.
Yeah, it will just manifest differently in different cultures. And I think we have to be sensitive to that, especially as feminists fighting against these prejudices, to be careful to not step across into another cultural perspective and not shift the way that we fight for these things and just assume that we can take our own personal perspective and just apply it. Feminism has to be adapted for every cultural setting.
Yeah, I agree.
Then another important point to highlight within a patriarchal system that often gets overlooked, I feel, is the emotional and mental labor that is still very much shifted to women. So when we talk about running a household, again, in a very traditional heteronormative binary sense, in general, emotional and mental labor is still very much the job, if I can call it that, of women. And this, for me, becomes quite a big feminist issue when you look at least in the South African context, domestic work. If you are hiring someone to clean your house, who is that person? Most of the time, if not all the time, it's a woman, firstly. And in our context, it's usually a woman of color who is from a disadvantaged background. So there's a whole lot of other issues going on there. But I think that in terms of emotional and mental labor, if you just think for a second about if I, for example, as a woman, have my own career and hire someone to come and do this work that is traditionally women's work, I'm hiring another woman to do that work. So she then has to do that emotional and mental labor, cooking and cleaning and doing whatever else is required of her at work and run somebody else's household. And then she still has to go home at night and do the same emotional labor at her own home, aside from the physical labor and all of that. You know, she's essentially caring for one family and one household and then going home and having to do that again at home, which I think is something that's so overlooked.
Yeah, it's actually also becomes a massive class issue.
Yes.
Because the domestic worker is seen as like a demeaning position where they get paid like shit.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of intersections of oppression happening.
Yeah, I just think that's an important thing to think about. And another thing that I've found is quite oppressive in a very discreet way is if you just look at the way that women and men are expected to dress or present themselves. So this might seem like a really silly point to make, but if you just go to any shopping mall and you look at the options available to men and women in terms of clothing and accessories and things like makeup, women are still very much in this position where it's like you have to have your hair done in a certain way and you have to wear makeup and you have to look presentable and you have to dress in a certain way. And just the range of options available, like dudes pretty much have very few options in terms of how you can actually dress. And women have like a million options. Even myself as a woman, I will look at what's available in shops and I'm like, I don't know how the hell to even use any of this stuff together because it's like so overwhelming. And it might seem like such a silly point, but that is mental labor to think, how do I put this item of clothing with this completely random item of clothing and make it look good and then still worry about makeup and hair? And sure, you don't have to. But if you look at a general professional career environment, yeah, it's all fine to say, I'm not going to, cave into those gender roles and buy the expensive clothes and the expensive perfume and the expensive makeup and then still figure out how to put it all together and waste an hour getting ready for a job interview. I don't have to do that. But if I don't do that, am I going to get the job?
Exactly.
Whereas
really
a dude
point.
Can just put on a suit and tie and go get a job looking slick.
Yeah.
He doesn't have to worry about 10 million other things before the job interview.
Yeah, that's a really good point, T. So I think another example of how patriarchy is harmful is historically the trend of men getting credit for women's discoveries. So there's actually a term for this that I found. It's called the Matilda effect. So you can look that up if you want. But 2 examples I thought of would be Rosalind Franklin, who discovered the DNA helix, which is a massive discovery, and men got credit for this.
It was Crick and Watson, right?
Crick and Watson, exactly. And they got credit for this and didn't even credit her. And this is a trend. I mean, you can Google search men who are credited for women's discoveries, and you'll find hundreds of examples. I mean, even in terms of veganism, I find it problematic that a lot of the intellectual work has been done by women, say, for example, Carol J. Adams, but a lot of the glory is kind of got by these young white straight men who are seen as these like amazing activists who wouldn't even have the arguments that they use if it weren't for the women who did the intellectual work in the first place.
Yeah.
Even speaking of veganism, there's an argument that the term vegan was actually coined by Dorothy Watson and not Donald Watson, so coined by his wife, that he's the one who was always sort of like the father of veganism, who coined the term vegan when it really was his wife who did.
Men just throughout history just dominate everything, even taking credit for ideas. And this is very much part of toxic masculinity. If you're not familiar with that term, Wikipedia defines it, once again, quite well. And they say scholars have used the term toxic masculinity to refer to stereotypically masculine gender roles that restrict the kind of emotions allowable for boys and men to express, including social expectations that men seek to be the dominant, in brackets, alpha male, and limit their emotional range primarily to expressions of anger. It goes on to say, Terry Coopers defines toxic masculinity as the constellation of socially regressive male traits that serve to foster domination, the devaluation of women, homophobia, and wanton violence. This is kind of at the core of the problem with patriarchy, is that it just breeds this toxic masculinity where men have to be this dominating, oppressive being. And it's bad for women and men. Like they say, it limits the range of emotional expression even for men.
So I think a good example of toxic masculinity is how it even permeates into the language that we use. You know, real men don't cry, or real men know how to hunt, or real men can fight. And then this can kind of translate into positive sexism or positive patriarchy, if you could call it that. Not that I'm saying it's a positive thing, but things like real men don't rape, or in veganism, like real men eat plants.
This becomes really, really problematic in terms of just gender roles as a whole. Whether you're trying to push for positive change or not, just the idea of having a real insert gender role is bad.
It's terrible.
Just be whatever the hell you want to be. And this kind of real men ideal filters down into other ideas like locker room talk.
This is the exact thing that people used when Trump on the bus left his microphone on and said, oh, you can just go up to a woman and grab her by the pussy.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
People excusing this horrific bullshit as like, oh, it's just boys being boys. It's just locker room talk.
And I think in situations where it might not be as overtly sexist as that, but any kind of jokes where there are just dudes around making jokes, whether they're homophobic jokes or sexist jokes or any kind of conversation that's going on when there are just men around, there's a lot to be said for the importance of men in these situations being heard, saying things that break those sexist attitudes down when women are not present. And even when women are present, for example, in social situations where men will joke around and make sexist jokes, even in the company of women or non-male identifying people, that is where it's so, so, so important not to shift the responsibility to women to correct that, but for men to be heard saying the right thing there and saying what you just said is not cool.
Yeah. I mean, there's a really good quote by Audre Lorde that I found that's so relevant to this that says, women of today are still being called upon to stretch across the gap of male ignorance and to educate men as to our existence and our needs. This is an old and primary tool of all oppressors to keep the oppressed occupied with the master's concerns. I think it's such a powerful quote. It's a way of kind of saying, why should women have to educate men on what is cool and not cool to say?
That ties in again with the emotional labor of like having to explain things and having to do this emotional and mental work which should be the work of men.
Yes. Like it should be the work of white people to call out other white people when they're being racist.
I can testify to the fact that as a woman, when I'm trying to explain feminist points, it is exhausting and it helps so much. Like, for example, I know when you're around, you'll often step in and call out dudes or back me up with those points. And that helps so much because it just takes away so much of that emotional drain of like experiencing these things every day and then still having to explain it to the very dudes who perpetuate those things.
Yeah, and I think it's what Audre Lorde says, like, you know, it's kind of a way to keep you occupied when you should really be focusing on yourself and just living your life.
And some of the things that we've spoken about up to now are very kind of mild or insidious little things that perpetuate patriarchy. Obviously, beyond these things, we get much more obvious and overt problems related to patriarchy, like domestic violence.
Yeah, exactly. So domestic violence is an issue that everyone can agree is like a really terrible example of sexism, patriarchy, misogyny.
It doesn't just happen to women, obviously we acknowledge that, but it is predominantly women that are at the receiving end of domestic violence.
Exactly. And like I was talking about language permeating into our culture, with a lot of men, when you talk to them about feminism or call them out for being sexist or anything, they'll say some shit like, oh, so you want to be equal? Does that mean I can hit women? It really bothers me that when you hear about equality, the first thing you think of is violent. How can I be violent?
Yes, exactly. So if you want equality and you want protection from my violence, then let me find a loophole for how I can be more violent towards you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's like that quote, so if we equal, can I hit you, is a major problem shown in language, but it's on the same continuum as brutal domestic violence.
Yeah.
There's actually a really good documentary that we watched recently that we can really recommend for anyone to watch if you want to get a good understanding of patriarchy, specifically within a South African context, called The People versus Patriarchy. You can just stream it on YouTube, so anyone can watch it.
Yeah, it's quite a difficult watch. There's some quite triggering parts, but it's a really, really brilliant documentary that I would definitely recommend. Another complicated and intense aspect of patriarchy and dealing with sexism is rape culture. I've heard a lot of, usually dudes, surprise, surprise, denying that rape culture even exists. So, but to define rape culture, again, we've used Wikipedia and we could use more reliable and academic resources, but we feel like these definitions are pretty good. So rape culture can be defined as a sociological concept for a setting in which rape is pervasive and normalized due to societal attitudes about gender and sexuality. Behaviors commonly associated with rape culture include victim blaming, slut shaming, sexual objectification, trivializing rape, denial of widespread rape, refusing to acknowledge the harm caused by sexual violence, or some combination of these.
I think the English Oxford Dictionary definition is also pretty good. And it says, a society or environment whose prevailing social attitudes have the effect of normalizing or trivializing sexual assault and abuse.
Yeah.
So to talk about one of the things mentioned in the Wikipedia definition, victim blaming is a massive example of rape culture. So basically what it is putting the blame on the victim who was raped, but not necessarily rape, but any form of sexual harassment or assault, and expecting them to be the ones who get justice or deal with it instead of the perpetrator. Even within the communities that we're involved in, say the local hardcore scene, there was a girl who came out saying she was sexually assaulted and she was blamed. And something that falls under victim blaming is not believing victims.
Yeah. And this ties in a lot to the reason why a lot of victims don't even report assault, which they then further get blamed for. But why didn't you report it, you know? But a lot of the time it's really difficult. It's traumatizing to report a case of sexual assault or rape or whatever it may be, because a lot of the time the victim will be re-victimized in reporting. She'll be questioned about every little thing, re-traumatized, having to live through all of that again and explain what happened, then often not even believed by police. Then even if it does go to court, such a small percentage of rapists are actually convicted.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what incentive is there really for victims to even report when they get re-victimized and just blamed?
Yeah, exactly. Especially in a patriarchal legal system. One thing that's been pretty encouraging, I think, even though a lot of people will disagree with me and say it's a negative thing, is this call-out culture of not being afraid to say the name of the perpetrator or call someone out and say, this guy did this thing. When it's always been like, oh, but shame, like, what about his career? What about how it's going to affect him? Please, if he did sexually assault this girl or whoever you're talking about, her life is much more badly affected than how his could potentially be affected. And most of the time, it's very unlikely that someone would report it falsely. Like you said, what incentive do they have? And so I think it's much safer to call someone out.
Yeah, I think there's so much emphasis placed on false reports, as if it's like the majority of cases, when we all know the majority of cases are legit cases and the majority of men do not get prosecuted, or perpetrated, should I say. So you favor the 0. whatever % chance that some guy's going to get falsely accused and have his life ruined. But what about the hundreds and thousands of women who actually have their lives ruined by actual assault?
Exactly. And I think as much as people want to say social media is bad, it's been really good in terms of this. And I'm hoping that this like rise in victims not being scared to call out perpetrators is going to deter people in a way from doing this, because now there's an actual social punishment.
And that's not to say that false accusations don't happen, but the perception is so skewed towards protecting men.
Yeah.
The whole of society protects men and maleness. So honestly, can we just give women a break for once and believe them? Like, it's really simple.
It's safe to say that as a feminist, you should always believe victims.
Exactly. Another related concept to victim blaming, which is really important and often overlooked, I think, is slut shaming. Often you will find, even in the context of victim blaming, what was she wearing? Why is she with so many guys all the time? And shaming that victim for how she is or how she's perceived to be. And yet guys never get that treatment. Guys never get told they should dress more modestly or act in more modest ways or not be promiscuous. That all falls onto women all the time.
Yeah, exactly. So a promiscuous girl would be called a slut when there is no equivalent for guys. It's like, oh, I slept with a lot of girls. Oh, well done, dude.
Yeah, tied to toxic masculinity is this idea that men should conquer women, you know, and again, we're talking in very heteronormative terms, but it's like this achievement level unlocked. And for women, it's just, you don't want to say how many dudes you've slept with because that's shameful. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, that leads on to the idea of like this bro culture, you know, of like congratulating each other, like, oh, well done, you know, for like this conquestual understanding of sex that you have.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It's ties in with the locker room talk.
Yeah, and I think even that seemingly innocent bro culture that a lot of people overlook ties in so closely to severe cases of sexual assault where perpetrators go unpunished, because the whole of society is kind of geared towards supporting men and not believing women. And there's this kind of culture where not only are guys joking about these things and congratulating each other for how many women they've slept with or whatever, it's also covering for each other. There are a lot of dudes who know that their friends have raped girls. There are a lot of dudes who not only listen to jokes and encourage jokes and participate in jokes, but know about and participate in sexual assault and harassment and cover for them. That's where it starts, in social situations where you know your friend has done something and you don't say anything.
Yeah. And I think you could even start to see other men kind of as your bros, you know? So it makes sense that male cops, male judges, all kind of are inherently biased towards each other.
Yeah. And there's probably often this underlying bias of like bro culture, even if it's not explicit, like you say.
And I think people who have privilege want to hold on to power.
Yeah.
And so like this bro culture is kind of like, yeah, self-congratulatory and look out for your bros and whatever. But it's also, I feel, about men holding onto power, because what a lot of people forget about rape, talking about rape culture, is that it's about power and not about sex.
Yeah.
So the way that we frame it often is like it's sexual conquest. People think of it so much in terms of a sexual act when actually it's an act of dominance and power.
Yeah, even when you look at victim blaming, it will be a case of, yeah, but what was she wearing? Look how short her skirt was. She was asking for it. She was flirting with him. And it becomes this narrative of you should be flattered by his advances, not realizing that the creepy advances from the dude at the bar or someone you know is actually this power play where by the end of the night, you're going to be sexually assaulted. And it starts with unwanted advances or unwanted comments where it becomes this unspoken feeling that I'm sure most women can relate to, where you are terrified. And that's why a lot of women are taught from a very young age to laugh off little sexist jokes, or when a guy is being a little bit too persistent, you have to laugh and be nice and say, no, I have a boyfriend, even if you don't, because you're valued more as some other man's property than as an individual who just wants to say no. So again, it's about power. So I have power over you until you tell me that someone else already has power over you. And it filters down into this idea that, oh, well, if this woman was sexually assaulted, she must have been asking for it, and that it should almost be seen as a compliment. Like you should be grateful that someone was interested in you, when it's not about sex. Like you said, it's about power and domination.
And I mean, the way that this often plays out in patriarchy is that because of rape culture, people who are guilty of sexual assault can end up in positions of power over people. For example, our past president, Jacob Zuma. I mean, the majority of the conversation happening around him being a bad person has been about how he's ruined the economy. Like that's the fucking worst thing to ever happen in the world. We heard people talking about wanting to hang him or stone him or something because of like the fact that he is corrupt and ruined the economy. When he was charged for raping a girl.
And nobody ever talks about her.
Yeah, crazy. That really, really bothers me. Fuck the economy. He raped someone.
Yeah.
So that's something that honestly, it just really like blows my mind. So I'm not sure about our international listeners, but recently in South Africa, over the last like 2-3 years, there's been this movement defined by the hashtag men are trash. And it's like really controversial and it sparked a lot of conversation. And I think some of the conversation has been pretty constructive, but there has also been a lot of really fragile and toxic masculinity that has come out of the conversation around the hashtag men are trash.
And as much as it's a frustrating thing that there's been a lot of resistance to this movement, which you'll explain in a bit, the fact that there are so many dudes who are opposing this movement is actually a good thing, I think, as well, because it's pretty easy to see the dudes that you thought were maybe feminist allies are actually not.
Yeah, like it's a good filtering system of people.
Exactly.
But we'll post a link in the show notes where you can read more about the movement if you want to. But basically, it was South Africa's response to domestic violence. According to the article that we're going to link, South Africa has the highest number of women who are murdered at the hands of their partners in the world. In fact, of the women who die every 8 hours, half of those are killed by their partners. The hashtag men are trash began when a few women on social media in 2016 basically took it upon themselves to call out problematic behavior of men, especially with regards to the emotional and physical abuse they have often experienced in their relationships. So the hashtag didn't catch on straight away and die down, but then last year in 2017, because of the really highly publicized murder of a woman called Karabo, the hashtag has gained considerable ground and transcended into a palpable movement shedding light on the abuse, femicide, and rape that is rampant in South Africa that often goes unreported.
For a bit of context, for those who didn't hear about the case, Karabo was murdered by her boyfriend and buried in a veld somewhere, I think, or a field. And apparently he even went as far as helping her parents to look for her.
Wow.
Obviously knowing full well that he had murdered and buried her somewhere. So that case was just like horrific on so many levels.
So the first thing that hashtag men are trash attempts to do is to get rid of the respectability politics that tries to police the way in which women decide to voice their anger and frustration against an oppressive patriarchal structure. To quote from the article, one needs to understand first and foremost that as women, and particularly as feminists, ours is not to deliver our message prettily garnished in a way that is perceived to be more palatable by men. In short, we are not duty-bound to mollycoddle the men who are a part of the very same patriarchal structure against which we are tirelessly fighting. To go further into the article, My biggest disappointment, however, has been the women who have rushed with band-aids and soothing words to the bruised male egos, their allegiance to the patriarchy worn proudly. Some of them even shared in the victim blaming, citing that they did not attract trash in their personal lives and that the rest of us should in essence stop being so bitter. Some even went as far as claiming that Karaba was murdered because she wouldn't leave her abusive boyfriend because of his money. So that's basically the history of how the hashtag Men Are Trash came around and what sparked it off.
Basically, the essence of the movement is to say that the majority of men have in some way directly or indirectly participated in the patriarchal structures that lead to like widespread domestic violence and abuse of women.
Taryn also wrote a blog post about the hashtag Men Are Trash, which we'll link to in the show notes that you can read. But I read it and I found it quite moving. And I took a few quotes out of it that I thought were really good. I hope you don't mind that I read them.
Go ahead.
So she writes, "Do I hate men? No. Do I think that all men are trash? No. But sadly, the majority of men, if not all, have at some point objectified or belittled women, treated us unfairly based on our gender, made oppressive jokes about women, or simply stood by silently as other men have done these things. In the past, I have heard some of my own male friends talk casually among themselves about women in ways that are quite frankly disgusting, and they all laughed. Because it's just harmless fun, right? And yet I would be very surprised to encounter a woman who has not personally been harassed, assaulted, or intimidated by a man, probably multiple times in her life. And we are taught to laugh it off, even if it terrifies or repulses us." Further in the blog post, "If the movement was relaunched with the phrase, 'Some men treat women badly sometimes,' I thought that was really funny, everyone would nod in agreement and be on their merry way, further perpetuating the patriarchal norms that are being challenged here. If a hashtag is more offensive than the fact that 1 in 3 South African women will be raped in her lifetime, then hashtag Men Are Trash is more relevant than ever. If nothing else, this movement has highlighted just how disconnected we are as a society from the reality that women face daily. If I had a rant for every comment I've seen saying something like, 'I get that there's violence against women, but you can't blame all of us.'" And the last quote I took out was, "We should not be prioritizing egos over safety. We should not be prioritizing feelings of the few who take offense over the daily fear felt by women because of men. If you are not trash, then it's not about you." I thought that was really good, T.
Thanks, Pete. You read it so beautifully.
Not really.
Just as it was intended. And I think all of these points that you've raised now and a lot of the reaction that has come from men saying, "Oh, but not all men." I mean, there's even hashtag not all men or "I'm not trash."
Yeah.
You know, a lot of dudes just being like super defensive and like, "I'm not trash. Why are you saying this? This is so divisive." And they're just completely missing the point, because I don't think I know a single dude who is not complicit in some way on some level, even if it wasn't intentional. Like, own up to that shit and be better. That's all it's saying.
Even just not saying anything
Exactly.
is being complicit.
Hearing an inappropriate remark or a catcall or whatever and doing nothing means you are part of the problem. So just sit down, shut up, and listen when women are telling you about the fear that they feel daily. Because quite frankly, if a guy turns to me and says, "My feelings are hurt because you're making me feel like I'm lumped in with trash," then quite frankly, you are trash, because you're not realizing that your feelings might be a little bit hurt, but every single day, almost every single woman has to be afraid if she has to walk outside by herself at night and has to worry about what she wears in case she's sending the wrong signal, or has to worry about whether she's going to be raped on a given day. So rant aside, but just sit the hell down and shut up.
That, I think, is the essence. Shut up.
Exactly.
So how I saw it, and I wish people, when they saw something controversial, because yes, of course, hashtag Men Are Trash was supposed to be controversial. You're saying men are trash. Why don't you think about the intended meaning instead of getting defensive immediately?
Yeah.
So what I think is really funny and quite a good point about the movement hashtag Men Are Trash is that men don't realize that they feed into it so much when they get defensive. Because what it's essentially saying is, shut up and listen to us.
Exactly.
And men are saying, "Oh, but I'm not a bad man."
And funny enough, almost every dude that I saw or read or heard get defensive about it, I know is trash.
Exactly.
I've seen them behave in trashy ways. And I'm like, yes, you are, bro. Just sit down.
Yeah.
Because all the dudes who were actually calling out those guys and saying, "Shut up and listen," and actually speaking as like a proper ally, are dudes that I know I would be comfortable with being alone in a dark alley with. The guys who got defensive, not so much.
Well, exactly. They don't realize this is the need for the hashtag because of how you are reacting to the hashtag.
Exactly. And that's not to say that every guy who has engaged in trashy behavior is like someone I would consider as a risk for perpetuating sexual assault. But like we've mentioned already, it's the smaller, more insidious things that are the main problem, because those are the things that go unquestioned. So there's a pretty good analogy. I can't remember where I saw it or heard it, but when you look at something like men are trash and the reaction being not all men, if you have a bowl of Skittles and someone says to you, there are 100 Skittles in that bowl and 38 of them contain a whole lot of cyanide, but not all of them. Are you going to eat any of them? Of course not. You're going to say, those Skittles are trash. Doesn't matter that they're not all full of cyanide.
Yeah.
The fact that any of them could potentially kill you, because let's face it, a dude could potentially kill you at any given time. You're not going to say, hey, don't eat that Skittle because 38 out of 100 of them contain cyanide and that's a bit of a risk. But don't worry, 62 of them are fine. So maybe like scrounge around in there and say some of these Skittles are trash, but you can eat the rest. No, you're just going to avoid the whole bowl.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying avoid all men and you get
it's a good analogy, I think. Like, you need to be careful of all the Skittles.
Yes, just be careful, because one of them might kill you and it might be the nice looking one that is your favorite color.
Yeah. You even had women responding to it saying, not all men are trash because my dad was great or my grandfather was great or whatever.
Yeah.
Most likely, your dad or your grandfather, sorry to burst your bubble.
Trash.
So it's a conversation and movement about like changing completely the way that as men, like in society,
Yeah, exactly. So the whole campaign around Men Are Trash has really highlighted the pervasiveness of rape culture and how important it is to acknowledge the behaviors and instances that are feeding into rape culture. So Pete found a pretty good article on shakesville.com, which we'll link in the show notes, that lists everyday examples of rape culture. And I think it makes it pretty clear that rape culture is on this kind of spectrum or continuum of behaviors and actions that feed into patriarchy and feed into rape culture. And a lot of them are seemingly innocent to a lot of people. A lot of people will overlook how harmful these things are. So we thought we'd include some of them just to show that it's not just overt sexual assault, but it's also the kind of more insidious little things that we overlook.
So the first point is tasking victims with the burden of rape prevention. So example, telling women, don't get raped, instead of telling men, don't rape.
Yeah, it's all about you should go for a self-defense course. You should wear a longer skirt. You shouldn't walk there by yourself at night. Whereas it could all be stopped by, as you say, just don't rape.
Yeah, not don't get raped.
Yeah.
The next point is the narrative that sex workers can't be raped and the assertion that wives can't be raped. Often I think people see sex workers as, their job is sex. People pay them to have sex with them, so how could they be raped? As if that voids their right to consent.
Exactly.
And the assertion that wives can't be raped, like I said, ties into this thing that like once you're married, you've kind of given all out consent.
Yeah, and that feeds into this very patriarchal idea that a woman is owned by her husband.
The next point is an understanding that says women cannot withdraw consent once sex commences. So this is like a major thing within rape culture that ties in with victim blaming is, oh, she said yes. But yeah, maybe she did say yes, and then whatever act started, and then she said no. But everyone will focus on the fact that she started with a yes, so that doesn't give her the right to then say no later.
You should have the right to stop whatever you're uncomfortable with at any point, even if you have said yes. And a major problem with this as well, which is patriarchy to the max, is this idea that a man's pride is more important than a woman's safety. Because in the same way that we are taught from a young age as girls to rather laugh off an unwanted advance, once you have given consent, it's very hard to take away that consent, not only because you might be putting yourself in a dangerous situation or creating conflict or something like that, but because it will bruise the ego of the man to say, I no longer want to do this with you. So we are prioritizing male pride over female safety.
Really good point. And we've already mentioned this point, but pervasive claims that women make rape accusations easily or falsely often, when the vast majority of rapes remain unreported.
Yeah, exactly.
The next point is the pervasive narrative that there is a typical way to behave after being raped, instead of the acknowledgement that responses to rape are as varied as its victims, that immediately following a sexual assault, some women go into shock, some are lucid, some are angry, some are ashamed, some are stoic, some are erratic, some want to report it, some don't, some will act out, some will crawl inside themselves, some will have healthy sex lives, some never will again.
This is also so important. The amount of people who will say, but why didn't you report?
Yeah.
You know, it's a severe trauma and people deal with trauma in different ways. Of course, there's no right way to behave.
Yeah. This also ties into the next point, that ignoring that there is very little incentive to report a rape. It's a terrible experience with a small likelihood of seeing justice served.
Yeah, exactly what we said earlier.
The next point is disbelief of rape allegations within families.
Yeah, I've seen this so many times in counseling where a woman will come in for counseling after a decade of never telling anyone that she was abused by her stepfather because she mentioned it to her grandmother or to whoever and was immediately disbelieved.
So sad, especially considering that it's very likely that someone close to you is the one who will perform the sexual assault.
Yeah.
The next point is street harassment and groping on public transportation, and equating raped women's bodies to a man walking around with valuables hanging out of his pockets. So to put this into context, if you go to this link that we'll put in the show notes, the woman who wrote the article has listed examples of this happening. So someone said like a woman being sexually assaulted is like the same thing as someone stealing something from a man, you know, as if it's even remotely the same. The next point is pretending that non-physical sexual assaults, like peeping tomming or catcalling, is totally unrelated to brutal and physical sexual assaults, rather than viewing them on a continuum of sexual assault. The next point is diminishing the gravity of any sexual assault, attempted sexual assault, or culture of actual or potential coercion in any way.
This is a massive one. And I feel like we are at this point, especially in like the South African context where severe sexual assault is so widespread that if you had to mention to anyone, like I've often gone for a jog and been catcalled or whatever, and I can just imagine a conversation surrounding that where I'm told that I'm being ridiculous for even being offended by that because it's such a small thing. But the thing is, it's not a small thing. It's on a continuum.
Yeah.
So as soon as you say that one thing is okay, then it makes it much easier for the next step up the continuum to be acceptable, and the next and the next and the next thing. You've got this pervasive culture of sexual violence, and then what?
Yeah.
We're in a situation like we're in now where you can't even report a rape without being blamed.
And an example of this happened when I was running an online radical politics / music blog. And I posted about this situation where the singer of this famous band kicked a girl off the stage for taking a selfie, or she had a selfie stick on stage or something. I mean, obviously that's not right. He physically assaulted someone by kicking her off the stage. Like he literally kicked her in her back off the stage. But someone commented and said, I don't see what the big deal is. Not like anyone was raped.
That is disgusting.
And I could not believe what I was reading. And I had to comment and say, so your bar of what's bad is rape.
To even make that comment and say it's not like she was raped is just so belittling to rape victims as well, that you can just be so blasé about saying something like that, which also diminishes the experience of anything less than rape. I say less than in inverted commas. You can have a violent sexual assault without actual penetration. And what that scumbag is saying is that's fine as well. It's not like she was being raped.
Because this is the bar of what's unacceptable. And these are people who are involved in a music scene that's supposed to be progressive. The next point is using the word rape to describe something that has been done to you other than a forced or coerced sex act. So saying things like, that ATM raped me with a huge fee, or like the tax services raped me on my taxes.
I can't explain to you how angry it makes me when people do this.
Yeah.
Like, think about the words you're using. Firstly, it's disgusting to even take a term like that and just make it nothing. But so many dudes will use words like this surrounded by people that they cannot possibly know if that individual has ever experienced a sexual assault. And you can just throw a word around like that, not even realizing how you might be triggering someone right next to you.
Yeah. And I think that this you hear pretty often, actually. The next example is rape jokes. And rape jokes are often seen as innocent things, like most jokes, but they aren't.
Yeah, and again, even when you look at jokes, I think the majority of people would reprimand someone for making a joke about rape, but let it slide when it's just a sexist joke.
Yeah.
But it's the same continuum again.
Exactly.
So even if you're not okay with rape jokes, ask yourself what jokes you are okay with, and if you're feeding into rape culture anyway.
Yeah. And I think humor often is a way that society accepts problematic things by laughing at them and making it like it's nothing.
Okay, so these are just some of the everyday examples of rape culture, which hopefully help to highlight that continuum or that spectrum of problematic behavior from the seemingly mild to the overtly problematic. But another issue that we wanted to talk about was the fact that a lot of the time violence against women is seen as a woman's issue. Gender issues are seen as women's issues only. And there's a pretty good YouTube video by someone called Jackson Katz called Violence Against Women, It's a Men's Issue. And he talks a lot about women being the focus of gender issues and feminist issues, whereas it should be the responsibility of men to fix these issues, which we've spoken about already. But one thing that he discusses is the use of language, in that gender issues and gender violence are portrayed in a way that men are completely removed from the conversation. So if you look at a normal sentence where you use active or passive voice, the normal way to write about something is in the active voice, where you'll say, John beat Mary. John did something to Mary.
Yeah.
So John is the focus. But then what happens, especially in rape culture, is it becomes more about Mary. So instead of saying John beat Mary, Mary was beaten by John, which then makes Mary a battered woman eventually. So Mary becomes the focus and John is removed. And that not only removes John from the conversation, but it becomes her whole identity as a battered woman. The same can be said for a rape victim. She is now a rape victim. She's no longer herself. And even if you look at when the perpetrator is included in the discussion, often we will say Mary was raped by so-and-so, or Mary was raped, full stop. There's never any emphasis on the dude or the perpetrator. And so when we look at finding solutions to these problems, when we are only talking about Mary as a rape victim or Mary as a battered woman, of course, when we're looking for solutions, we are looking at what can Mary do to not be a rape victim or not be a battered woman.
There's a vast difference between saying John beat Mary and Mary was beaten by John. And basically language influences the way we think about these things.
Yeah, if you look at a completely different example, for example, if someone is abusing a dog, you would say, John kicked a dog. You would never say the dog was kicked by John. The emphasis will always be on the perpetrator. Or John stole money from Frank. You won't say Frank was robbed by John.
Or Frank is a robbed person.
Yeah, it never shifts so much towards the victim that the perpetrator is removed from the debate. Yet when we talk about sexual violence, it always becomes about the victim. So that's just something to keep in mind, that we've removed men from the conversation where they should be in the center of the solution. We need to seriously look at shifting that responsibility to dudes. And you can understand why, with all of this victimization towards, and obviously we're talking a lot about men and women, but predominantly women, you can understand why there is a lot of anger that builds up in this process. And feminism often gets a lot of flack for just being a bunch of angry women, you know, the man haters, the so-called feminazis, as people like to call them, as we mentioned previously. But it's so important to acknowledge how appropriate a lot of that anger actually is. Yes, some feminists are really fucking angry. Some of them do hate men. But you know what? It's probably justified.
Probably, yeah.
So to me, the widespread criticism and often exaggeration of this anger is actually the perfect example of patriarchy. And it's an attempt to silence women. Women are not supposed to be angry. That's a male trait. Women are not supposed to be aggressive. That's a male trait. So this idea of these angry man-hating feminists is a patriarchal one, because it's saying sit down and shut up and be quiet like a woman should, which just makes me angry on so many levels.
Yeah, I mean, an example of like how women aren't supposed to be angry is this recent thing with Serena Williams, right? By now you probably realize T and I aren't sports people.
I did know who Serena Williams was.
Yeah, I knew she was a famous tennis player too, but we really don't watch or follow sports at all.
Ever.
But we thought we would go check this out. People described her as like, oh, she lost her shit. She was like going crazy. She had a meltdown. She was hysterical. And you know, if you go and watch the footage of Serena Williams so-called losing her shit, she really is not.
So basically, if you didn't see what happened, she was accused of essentially getting coaching from her coach, which is not allowed, and whatever, she got a warning or whatever it is. I don't know how it works in tennis. But she basically said I wasn't cheating, and she got angry with is it an umpire, referee?
Just say referee.
She got angry with the person in charge of making sure everything's legit, and basically said, how dare you accuse me of cheating? And she got angry, and watching the video, I could see she was full of rage, but she was so much calmer than the picture I had in my mind that everyone was describing.
Yeah.
She is probably also, well, she has been on the receiving end of racial discrimination and gender discrimination for her whole career.
Yeah.
So, of course, she's going to get mad if she feels like there was gender bias. Of course.
And yes, at one point she lost a point against Osaka. It was her name. And she smashed her racket on the ground. Yes, she got angry and she smashed her racket on the ground. Maybe that's not the most sports personally like conduct. But and a lot of men have done that and they never get the same reaction. Like, oh my goodness, she broke her racket.
Yeah. It's against the rules. So what a lot of people are saying, yeah, but if it's against the rules, she's broken the rules, she must be punished. Fine, cool. But then the dudes must be punished in the same way, and they're just not.
They just aren't, yeah. And if you go and look at YouTube videos of other tennis players losing their shit,
all dudes,
all guys, they get away with so much worse.
Yeah, exactly. Way worse. So high five to her. Seriously, I think she's awesome. And
she's pretty badass,
she's
actually.
So badass.
But it's an example of what you're talking about, of how violence, aggression, anger are male traits. And when a woman behaves like that, it's unacceptable.
Even if men and women are both reprimanded, the language used, again, so problematic. So the guy was passionate, or he reacted strongly and got angry and whatever, but it's never seen as like an overreaction. But with a woman, it's like, oh, she lost her mind and she was so dramatic and she had a meltdown, and all of these words with a negative connotation, even bordering on questioning her mental health.
Yeah.
So I think we need to realize that the underlying rage that's built up for a lot of women is very much justified. And there's a really, really good TED talk by Tracy Ellis Ross called A Woman's Fury Holds Lifetimes of Wisdom. And she basically describes a scenario where a friend of hers was in a post office and a man obviously needed to get something that was in front of her or whatever, and literally just grabbed her shoulders and moved her out of the way. And obviously that's rude, but I think the majority of people wouldn't expect a furious reaction. And she describes her feeling as fury in response to that. And I think I would feel the same. Basically, the essence of the talk is this fury that builds up within women from living in a patriarchal world, where there are these little microaggressions, kind of assertions of power and dominance over women's bodies, that builds up this rage and this fury that sometimes is seen as this exaggerated emotional response or disproportionate reaction to something seemingly small and harmless, but it's not. It's behaviors that are essentially communicating power and dominance over women. So yeah, it's a really good talk. I would really encourage everyone to watch it, and I'm sure women in particular will be able to relate to that fury.
On that note, there's a really good essay by Audre Lorde called Uses of Anger, Women Responding to Racism, that I think is also really a good thing to read, kind of tying in with women being angry and this like fury that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think as we've mentioned already before, anger is seen as such a negative thing when it comes from a woman, and it's actually so justified in so many contexts, and it can be used for a lot of good as well. But I personally want to challenge men specifically when speaking to a woman that they perceive as excessively angry or overly emotional, to sit down, shut up, and realize that you may see an overreaction. But what you don't see is the story, or the handful of stories, or the hundreds of stories that have fueled that woman's rage. These are stories that she might never tell you, and she might never have told anyone in her life.
So a while ago I found a split album by a band called Judiciary and another band called Mortality Rate. And the singer of Mortality Rate does a spot in this Judiciary song that I think is really good and ties in really well here. For those who aren't used to this style of music, it's very abrasive, loud and angry, but I think it ties in really well to what Tia's just said. And for those who can't hear the lyrics, she says, "I am pure goddamn fury, I will devour you whole."
Yeah, and this song in particular could be about a bunch of different things. It's not necessarily a directly feminist song, but I think anyone hearing this can hear the fury in her voice, and this is the kind of fury that I'm talking about. This underlying rage that is just waiting to bubble over from all of these little microaggressions that we've all had since childhood, basically. And I think it will just illustrate how that feels so well.
It gave me chills, so here we go. So that was the song Pure Fury on the split with judiciary and mortality rate. So I don't think a conversation about feminism can be complete without also including a conversation about intersectionality. And so the last thing that we wanted to speak about was intersectionality. So basically intersectionality is just understanding and acknowledging that different people experience different interlocking and intersecting oppressions based on things like class, race, sexual orientation, age, disability, and gender, and that these things don't exist separately from each other. So in that way, you cannot have feminism that is exclusionary of racial issues or ageist issues. So that's basically what intersectionality is all about. Recognizing, for example, that a woman of color will experience both racism and sexism, and she sits at the intersection of where these oppressions exist.
Yeah, and I think this is again why we keep highlighting that a lot of what we're discussing today is very much from our own perspective, and we're not claiming to understand the perspective of people from different cultural, class, age, whatever category that we're not in. But this is why we've also tried to highlight the fact that when we're talking about male privilege, there is also white privilege, and that a white female feminist needs to be mindful of the fact that, yes, while in the majority of her life she is oppressed by men, she also oppresses men based on race in other interactions, possibly based on the fact that she has racial privilege or class privilege. So we're not going to go too much into the details of intersectionality, but we just want people to be aware of these things so that even the points where we seem to be talking in very simplistic terms, we are mindful of the fact that there are a whole lot of other layers to everything that we're discussing.
An example of intersectionality and how it can be useful is that through using an intersectional lens, you can see how certain things matter more than others. So, for example, Black lives matter more than white feelings. Black people being oppressed matters more than how white people feel about Black people being oppressed.
Yeah, I think that when we say that we're highlighting our own perspectives here, we are mindful that our perspectives are just one of the many perspectives, but that when we have these discussions about things like feminism or racism or any of these oppressions, we have to recognize that sometimes there will be discomfort within ourselves because we ourselves engage in certain oppressive behaviors, whether we realize it or not, and we contribute to oppressive systems, whether we realize it or not. But we need to put our feelings aside sometimes and recognize when our own behavior is problematic or when the things that people point out to us are uncomfortable. We need to sit down and listen and put our own feelings aside.
So an example of this, to use another Audre Lorde quote, is if white American feminist theory need not deal with the differences between us and the resulting difference in our oppressions, then how do you deal with the fact that the women who clean your houses and tend your children while you attend conferences on feminist theory are, for the most part, poor women and women of color? What is the theory behind racist feminism? So I think this was so much ahead of her time that she's saying, like, if your feminism is not intersectional, it's nothing.
Then another point we want to just briefly mention is that we also can't ignore veganism when we're talking about feminism, because we're talking about the intersection of all these different kinds of oppression, and the oppression of non-human animals is just as valid as the oppression of different groups of humans. And there's a pretty good quote in Carol J. Adams' book, The Sexual Politics of Meat, where she says, "Meat is a symbol for what is not seen, but is always there, patriarchal control of animals." And she speaks a lot about the overlaps between patriarchy and the culture of eating animals, and the oppression of non-human animals and the oppression of women.
Yeah, I would highly suggest reading The Sexual Politics of Meat by Carol J. Adams. I think a lot of intersectional feminists don't include veganism in their intersectionality, and it's kind of inseparable in my opinion. And I think if you are a feminist, you should be vegan. Just like if you are vegan, you should be a feminist.
Yeah.
So I think related to veganism is environmentalism, that I personally don't think that patriarchy and capitalism can be separated, and that capitalism is kind of a manifestation of patriarchy, and that capitalism is kind of the system that has ruined the earth and seen the earth as this thing to dominate, you know, something to dominate, something to take control of. And I think there's no mistake in why people often refer to Mother Nature, Mother Earth, you know, and capitalism is this very like male system of economics. That was just an abstract kind of idea that I had.
Yeah, I think it's definitely relevant. And I think it's also important, we've kind of touched on all of this already, but if you're a feminist, you should also be anti-racist, anti-homophobia, and anti-transphobia, and anti all of those discriminatory and oppressive ways of thinking.
Yeah, there's a really good, another Audre Lorde quote that I found. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives.
Yeah.
So in that way, your feminism cannot exist by itself. It has to be intersectional.
That's such a good point. Yeah, so I think we've covered very basically a lot of different little elements related to feminism. So hopefully we've given you a bit of an overview if you're new to feminism. Maybe we've given you 1 or 2 points to think about if you already consider yourself a feminist. And if this was a very basic conversation for you, maybe it sparked some ideas in terms of what you think we might be able to speak about in future episodes. So if you have any comments or questions or anything that you want to contribute to this episode, then please send us an email and let us know what you think.
So a lot of what comes up within like modern feminism and what people are talking about now is radical feminism. And I love the narrative that's coming out of that conversation that goes something like, we want liberation, not equality. Because I think a lot of the way people see equality is like women and non-male identifying people want to reach where men are.
Yeah.
Instead of, we want to be liberated. We want our own identity and our own future. So I think we should aim to make our feminism more radical and not a submissive, we just want to get to where you are, men, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think the concept of equality isn't about getting to where men are, but I can see how the language of it kind of perpetuates that male ideal. Like, we want to be equal to men, and that is problematic in the language of it. So yeah, I totally agree with that. Liberation over equality, for sure.
Or make our equality a liberatory equality.
Yes, exactly. Because let's face it, we don't want to be how men are. So in summary, you're either feminist or you're sexist.
Yeah, there's no in between. If you think that women and non-male identifying people matter and have worth and are equal to men in that worth, then you are a feminist.
Exactly. So be angry, be unapologetic,
Be a feminist. So yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. Here's T's song, Good Guys. Love and liberation.
And all this fragile masculinity just throwing all these lines at me like, if you feel unsafe or you're not okay, just stay away. If you're not okay or you feel unsafe, that's okay, just stay away. Just don't make any noise, you chose to play with the boys. Gotta learn to toughen up and